First up will be Keith Phillips. Keith joined the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas in January 1984. His areas of concentration include regional economics and economic forecasting. Research Papers in Economics, which tracks publications in economics, ranks Phillips in the top 5% of economists across the world in terms of number of distinct publications. Over the past 16 years, Keith has been the most accurate forecaster for Texas job growth in the Western Blue Chip Job Economic Forecast. In August 1996, Keith was transferred to the San Antonio branch in an effort to improve the regional economic coverage of the Dallas office and to better serve the needs of the South Texas community. He teaches courses in managerial economics and quantitative analysis in the Executive MBA program at UTSA. He attained his PhD in economics from Southern Methodist University and holds a BA and MA in economics and a Bachelor of Journalism degree in news editorial from the University of Missouri at Columbia. After Keith will be Adam Hamilton. Adam serves as president and CEO of Southwest Research Institute, one of the nation's largest independent providers of advanced scientific and applied technology solutions. Southwest Research Institute conducts more than $500 million of research each year and thrives on providing broad technical expertise and vast supporting infrastructure for the benefit of clients, government and commercial, and the public. In February 2017, Southwest Research Institute was named San Antonio's Business of the Year. Adam holds an MS degree in engineering and a BS degree in aerospace engineering, both from the University of Texas at Austin. It doesn't say whether he applied to business school. He's been a professional engineer since 1993. During his career, he's provided technical expertise to myriad programs in government and industry, while also providing business and community leadership. His multidisciplinary technical expertise includes engineering, science, and risk assessment. Before joining Southwest Research Institute, Adam was the founding president and chief executive officer of Signature Science, LLC, based in Austin, Texas, which is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Southwest Research Institute. Prior to starting Signature Science, he spent many formative years at Austin-based Radiant Corporation, where he benefited from the advice and counsel of several mentors. He currently serves on the executive committee of the United Way of San Antonio and Bexar County. He's also served as the co-chair of the 2015 United Way Volunteer of the Year event and as part of the campaign cabinet in 2016. Adam is currently serving on the External Advisory Committee of the University of Texas at Austin Department of Aerospace Engineering and Engineering Mechanics. He's also on the board of the Greater San Antonio Chamber of Commerce and the University of Texas at San Antonio College of Sciences Advancement Council. Following Adam will be John Dickson. John is an internationally recognized security leader, entrepreneur, and principal at Denim Group Limited. He has spent nearly 20 years gaining hands-on experience in intrusion detection, network security, and application security in the commercial, public, and military sectors. It's one of those things you read and you think you're going to be scared. As Denim Group principal, he helps executives and chief security officers of Fortune 500 companies and government organizations launch and expand their critical application and security initiatives. His leadership has been instrumental in Denim Group being honored by Inc. magazine as one of the fastest growing companies in the industry for 5 years in a row. A former U.S. Air Force officer, John served in the Air Force Information Warfare Center and was a member of the Air Force Computer Emergency Response Team. Since his transition to the commercial arena, he's played significant client-facing roles with companies such as Trident Data Systems, KPMG, and Secure Logic Corporation. John is a popular speaker on security at industry venues, including the RSA Security Conference, the SANS Institute, the Open Web Application Security Project, and at other international security conferences. He's a sought-after security expert and regularly contributes to Dark Reading and other security publications. He also regularly contributes to the Denim Group blog, where he writes about key security industry issues such as software security and cybersecurity policy. A distinguished fellow of the International Systems Security Association, he's been a certified information systems security professional since 1998. John is currently the chairman of the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce Cybersecurity Committee. He's also a member of the prestigious Texas Business Leadership Council, the only statewide CEO-based public policy organization that serves as a united voice for the state's senior executives to participate in the legislative and regulatory process. Most recently, he was the past chairman of the Texas Lyceum, a leadership group that prepares leaders for the state of Texas, and served as the chairman of the North San Antonio Chamber of Commerce. He also served as the local president of the Information System Security Association and was an honorary commander of the 67th Cyberspace Wing, which organizes, trains, and equips cyberspace forces to conduct network defense, attack, and exploitation. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Texas A&M University, then cleaned up his resume by obtaining a Master of Science degree from Trinity University and a Master's in Business Administration from the University of Texas at Austin. I added the cleanup part. He resides in San Antonio, Texas, where he's married with 2 children. So before I turn it over, on your table there are cards for questions. So as you think of questions, please take a moment to jot them down. We're going to collect those cards at the end for the Q&A part. I will tell you this is our 4th event. We've had some great questions, so the bar is high. So I hope you'll think about it and think about what you want to hear back from our panelists. We'll also have some mics circulating if you prefer to speak rather than write. So with that, let me turn it over to Keith. Thanks, Keith.
Well, thank you for inviting me here today. It's always a pleasure to speak on the program. I apologize in advance. I'm kind of under the weather this morning with allergies, but I usually speak pretty loud, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me. My son Bryce is a Longhorn. I was very happy about that the first 4 years, and the next 2 years not so much. I like, it's not the Longhorn part, it's the, I want the word alumni after it. So anyway, he claims that one of the reasons why it's taken him so long is that he's in computer science, and that if he was in an easy major like economics, he could have easily graduated in 4 years. So anyway, I have a lot of data I'm going to show you, and I have 15 minutes to do so. Economists love data, and it reminds me of a story of 2 economists that were hiking in Big Bend. I didn't use this last year, did I? Okay. There were 2 economists hiking in Big Bend, and they were out hiking for quite a while, and one of them realized he didn't have any idea where he was. Could you imagine that? 2 economists lost. So he asked his friend, could you look at your data and tell me where we're at? So he pulled out a map, and he was looking around and looked at the map, and then he pulled out his compass, and he was looking at the compass, and then he pulled out his GPS, and he looked at that. He said, so the other guy says, well, what'd you determine? He said, well, see that mountain over there? I said, yeah. Well, that's where we're at. But anyway, hopefully the slides are up here. Let me make sure this is on. There we go. So the Texas economy enters this year growing very strongly and very broad-based. As you might know, we had a few slow years back in 2015 and 16 when oil prices fell. This was a really interesting time in Texas, as many people throughout the U.S. had figured that Texas was growing strongly prior to this because of oil prices, because of the amount of oil, particularly in the fracking revolution that was being produced in Texas. And with oil prices way down, Texas would likely go into recession. We had a new bank president at the time, and when he came in, and I had predicted both at the beginning of 2015 and 16 that Texas economy would slow but not go in recession, people in D.C. kind of looked at him in a strange way and not really believed them. In fact, some of them voiced that opinion. And I think outside of Texas there is this view that the business cycle in Texas is totally due to the cycle in oil prices. Well, it turned out that I'm still employed, so Texas did not go into recession. Job growth slipped below the national average in 2015 and 16, but last year, with oil prices stabilizing above $40 per barrel and a rebound in our manufacturing sector, with much to do about an improvement in the world economy, Texas rebounded last year, and I expect this momentum to carry forward into this year. We certainly hear a lot about from businesses about the optimism with the tax plan, and that just added to growth that was already occurring. So this should be a good year for Texas. So I gave all my information without any slides, but I'm very uncomfortable with that. So we're going to go through the slides. I have a few slides on the national economy. The nation continues to grow, continues to kind of absorbed the labor force that was created, the excess in the labor force that was created after the Great Recession. And job growth over the last several years has been above trend, and so has real GDP, although not at a booming level. The labor market is likely below full employment, which means that it's going to put upward pressure on wages and inflation. And real GDP growth is likely to hold steady at above trend rate of growth this year. This is a pace of job growth all the way back to 2002, monthly job growth. You can see the big declines during the Great Recession, pretty steady job growth since then. We used to think of job growth, when you hear the monthly numbers, that above 200,000 would be a good rate of job growth, and that was while the unemployment rate was at a high level and we had excess labor capacity. But with the demographics suggesting lower growth in the labor force, and with the unemployment rate close to full employment, what we consider a good rate of job growth now in the establishment surveys between 60 and 120. And you can see it's been persistently above 120. Last year it averaged 171,000 per month. That means it continues to drive down the unemployment rate. And it's likely with job growth estimated this year, we're going to see further declines in the unemployment rate. And that's certainly good for workers, good for graduates at UT Business School, but represents a significant challenge for employers. So GDP growth, this is just a chart. Last year we had, with the fourth quarter data coming in, is about 2.5%. Really, a lot of economists estimate the long term, if productivity remains what it's growing like in the last 5 years and the labor force slowing as projected, really trend GDP is no longer 3%, it's around 1.8%. So 2.5% is actually above trend GDP growth, and it's expected to be 2.6% this year. So that's the U.S. economy. It continues to grow, continue to add jobs, continue to see tightening labor markets. So Texas, I gave you a little background already. We had been growing strong. We had a couple years of weakness with low energy prices and actually a strong dollar. Texas is slightly above average in terms of manufacturing, but in terms of exports, we're one of the top 5 states in terms of the impact of exports on our state. So last year, Texas grew much faster than the previous year. The pickup was due to a rebound in energy and manufacturing. Jobs grew about 2.4% last year, and we're expecting them to grow about 2.8% this year. This is a chart of Texas in terms of ranking among the states for last year. These black bars represent energy-producing states. And you can see Texas was the strongest of the energy-producing states, and it was the 5th fastest growing state in the nation. As I said before, the previous 2 years, Texas had dipped below the nation. But in 2014, when oil prices were high, Texas was the 3rd fastest. So we kind of dipped down a little bit and pulled back. But Texas really separated itself from other oil and gas states over the past several years because most of those saw actually job losses in 2015 and 16. So this is a chart of Texas relative to the national average. And you can see that these black bars are Texas, and the national average is red. And you can see that at least since 1996, but this you could project it backwards. Texas generally grows faster than the national average. We grow about 1 percentage point faster in terms of job growth. And this has nothing to do with the energy sector. Energy sector prior to the mid-2000s was on a long-term decline in Texas. What this has to do with is a low cost of living, low cost of doing business. Basically, why do some states grow faster than others? It's because people want to live here and businesses can maximize profits here. And so in the long term, that's what causes Texas to grow faster than other states. The last, as I showed, we dipped below the nation, but that was just a temporary weakness in oil prices. If you look at the unemployment rate, as I said, the labor force will be one of the constraints on growth this year in Texas. Texas unemployment rate, let's see, in and out, doesn't it? Hear me? Is the mic set? You got it? Okay, so the Texas unemployment rate in December was 3.9%. In November, it was 3.8%. That was the of unemployment in the state since we have data in the mid-70s. So despite all these oil price booms in the past, the unemployment rate has never been as low in Texas as it is right now. So while things are picking up and we have this tax cut that's motivating a lot of growth in capital expenditures in businesses throughout the state, we're going to face quite a bit of labor market tightness. You can see the U.S. unemployment rate is also very low. And if you look at a broader unemployment rate like the U6 that includes discouraged workers, those unemployment rates are higher, but they're also at very low rates relative to their historical average. So if you look across the regions of the state, one of the interesting things is during this oil price weakness in Texas in 2015 and 16, most of the weakness was occurred in the Houston economy. It went from about 4% to zero growth. Zero growth was actually pretty good for Houston given oil price decline. In the early 80s when oil prices declined, similarly Houston saw a job growth decline of about 6.5%. So zero was good, and a lot of it has to do with the petrochemical boom that's occurred along the Gulf Coast during this time. Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin, I call the I-35 corridor, barely even slowed during the decline in the energy sector. We just continued to grow rapidly. Fort Worth saw some weakening, hits a big manufacturing sector and has oil and gas. Corpus Christi obviously has oil and gas. So most of the weakening that occurred and then the rebound was in the energy areas of the state. Most of the other areas just continue to grow very strongly. Goods producing sector, you see the same story here with the declines in manufacturing and a rebound last year in manufacturing and mining. The other service sectors just continue to grow throughout this period. The service sector, while there's a lot of volatility in this measure, this is our service sector outlook survey, it continues to show expansion and a pickup overall toward the end of the year. Manufacturing has really accelerated, showing highs not seen since before the Great Recession in terms of production and new orders and outlooks. One of the areas of concern is that this is a Census Department estimate that Texas ranks 4th in terms of the number of jobs tied to exports, and Mexico's represents 40% of our exports. So any kind of problem or ending of any trade agreements such as NAFTA will play a significant challenge to Texas. Our exports have been growing and actually since about the middle of last year. That's the Texas exports is the black line. Texas minus the U.S. is the red line, and the green line is the value of the dollar. It's come down. The Texas value of the dollar has come down since early last year, providing some stimulus to our manufacturers. Construction activity is slowed, mostly in Houston and some of these bigger projects that went through the data, such as a $10 billion natural gas terminal. But it had slowed, still remained at high level. Construction really never got into trouble. Well, we got 1 minute. But it has been picking up. The energy sector has been picking up since the mid-2016. This green line is the rig count. It's flattened out somewhat. But with the surge in oil prices in recent months, or the pickup in oil prices, we expect continued health in the energy sector. We do an energy survey at the Dallas Fed. It's the largest survey in the U.S. And all the measures, business activity, company outlook, capital expenditures, all spiked up in the fourth quarter of last year, suggesting continued growth in the energy sector. Respondents expected to end this year at about $59 per barrel for West Texas Intermediate. The leading index for Texas has been strong. growing quite rapidly during the final 3 months of last year, suggesting a pickup in job growth this year. This red line is the leading index. There's my forecast, somewhere around 2.8 with a range of 2.3 to 3.3. San Antonio has been strong throughout this period. Last year we had 3.4% job growth. Healthcare has been very strong. It's one of our key sectors in San Antonio. Leisure and hospitality got a boost, in construction at the end of the year because of Harvey. We have I assume a lot of people relocated from the Gulf Coast staying in San Antonio, at least temporarily. But the fundamentals of healthcare and leisure and hospitality have been strong in San Antonio, driving our growth. I did throw in a thing, given the title of this thing. Two of the areas that San Antonio is known for in terms of growth going forward is cybersecurity and biotech, and both those have been growing quite strongly, both from 2012 and over the last year or so. So in summary, after a couple weak years of growth, last year was a rebound year in Texas. During the weakness, we saw that Texas is not solely dependent on energy. We still continue to grow despite a big decline in our energy sector. We did much energy producing states. Last year, energy and manufacturing rebounded. We grew close to 2.5% last year, and we're likely to grow close to 3% this year. San Antonio has been continue to grow over this period. We expect growth to be between 3% and 4% this year in terms of job growth in San Antonio. The biggest risk is always oil prices, but also any big changes to trade agreements that would affect our exports. So that's all. Here's some publications we do. Thank you.
Good morning. It works. That's a great thing. So thank you for having me here today. My name is Adam Hamilton, and today I'd like to talk to you about innovation in applied research and development. So first of all, look at this picture. Isn't that beautiful? This is Hurricane Isabel 2003, picture taken from the International Space Station. Now, it's beautiful from this view, but if you're in the path of this hurricane, it doesn't look so nice, as you might imagine. So you would think, with all of the science and technology available to us today, that we might be able to forecast where this hurricane might go. So if you watch the news, if you were worried about this hurricane hitting you, you might see a chart like this. Does that look familiar to you? All these different lines represent different models that predict the path of this hurricane. Now, the models themselves are pretty good. What's missing is the data that feeds these models. The data is still collected in what can be considered archaic ways. We fly airplanes through the tropical cyclones, through the hurricanes, to collect that data. And that's difficult. It doesn't provide a lot of data, and hence we get these wild variations in models. So while that's quite funny to look at a chart like this, if you think about this particular hurricane cost 51 people their lives, cost over $5.5 billion in damages to properties and homes, and disrupted many millions more, it's something that really was crying out for innovation. So what happened, Southwest Research Institute built 8 satellites that were launched in December of 2006, now in orbit around the Earth. These satellites are small. They're about the size of a desk, maybe an IKEA desk, pretty small. And what they do is collect information that was already out there. GPS satellites broadcast data all the time. The RF signal from GPS is reflected off of the ocean surface. These satellites collect that data, compare it to the original GPS data, and from that we can determine the ocean state. How tall are the waves? How fast are the waves? What direction are they going? And that's highly correlated to wind, which is what's needed for input into these hurricane models. So CYGNSS, the Cyclone Global Navigation Satellite System, is, to me, a really good example of innovation. It's going to provide that better and denser data set that is really life-changing. So Innovation, I think, is illustrated by that particular example. Innovation, I believe, is a combination of creativity, invention, discipline, and a secret ingredient. So to figure out what that secret ingredient might be, let's look back a couple of thousand years to a period that was called the Three Kingdoms period in what is now modern-day China. 220 to 280 AD, tripartite rule. There were the Wei, the Shu, and the Wu. They often warred. There were other warring clans in the region. Armies would go all over this area, which is a very large geographic area. So they needed some way to tell how to get home. They'd go off to war, they'd have to get back. So how do you do that in ancient days when the technology was fairly limited? Well, there was the prototypical mechanical engineer, a guy named Ma Jun, who was very good at building advanced weapon systems and all different kinds of mechanical devices, very good with mathematics. So he took on this problem. He built something that's called the south-pointing chariot. Really an ingenious invention. It's the modern differential red that you sell in so many cars these days. This was a cart that you'd pull along while you marched. And if you deviated from south, you have to calibrate this thing first, but there was a card figure on top. Now this is a modern reproduction here. This card figure would point south, which was the important direction for them in that day. If you drifted off to one direction, the arm would continue to point south, so you'd know you'd have to correct your march. You could get back home, provided that you built it exactly right, provided the land you were going over was very smooth, provided there were no hills. So it was a great invention, but not necessarily the innovation needed to get these people home. So this is what I believe might be one of the earliest forms of disruptive technologies. This is called lodestone. Lodestone is a naturally occurring mineral that can be magnetized. It is. You can put paper clips on here, whatever you want to do that stick to it. Other parts of China were working with lodestone, and what do you think they were doing? They weren't the mechanical engineers, they were the scientists. They actually were able to build a compass out of lodestone. So instead of having a cart with all this intricate design in it, all you had to do was float a small carved piece of lodestone in water, and it would align itself with north-south. Disruptive technology hit early on. So what Ma Jun was really missing was awareness. He built something that he was familiar with. You've all heard the expression, to a man with a hammer, every problem is a nail. That comes from Maslow in 1966. And that's why I think that Cygnus is a great example of innovation, because we didn't just build satellites. We could have built a satellite with all kinds of transmitters and different types of sensors and equipment. But we took a very simple approach, collecting data that's already there to use to our benefit. This is the Pacific gray whale. It has a great strategy for life. It goes from breeding grounds to eating grounds to breeding grounds to eating grounds. It's kind of like your millennial children, perhaps. Not a bad job if you can get it. But it goes back and forth. That's the strategy of it. But sometimes what we see is a behavior called spy hopping. This is not only the gray whales in the Pacific, but all cetaceans do this. They stop and they come up vertically out of the water and just stand there, so to speak. But what's different? They're getting many of their sensing organs out of their usual environment. Their eyes, their ears, their mouth, where they have a sense of smell. They also have some sensors on the tips of their nose called the rostrum that is very helpful, and they're looking around. They're evaluating the environment that they're in to see where there are, what's different. Are there threats? Are there opportunities? Well, they also just may be having some fun. According to whale guides, that's what they do. So I like this analogy because what we do at Southwest Research Institute is we spy hop. Sometimes we force ourselves to get out of the water, out of what we see every day. Every day we think about the same things, the same problems. Let's get out of that. Now, at the Institute, it's very easy to do that because this figure is a picture of the pressure hull for the Alvin submarine. one of the deepest diving sea vehicles in the world. Designed, built, and tested at Southwest Research Institute right here in San Antonio. Don't ask how we test. We're not even near an ocean, are we? But we have our own test cells for that. This you might recognize as what's now called the dwarf planet Pluto. I object to that because when our New Horizons spacecraft launched in 2006, Pluto was a full-scale planet. Somewhere along the way, the 9 years it took to get there, it was reduced to a dwarf planet status. But regardless, it's beautiful. And the discoveries that were made as we flew by in July of 2015 were quite amazing, as well as the imagery you see like this. So what we like to say is that we use innovation to accelerate the applied research to solve problems that range from deep sea to deep space. So it's pretty easy for us to spy hop at the Institute. We have different technical divisions, but we can get out of those divisions and talk to other scientists, other engineers, mathematicians, statisticians, even business people, and find out what's going on in their world and be more aware of what needs to be done. So it's not just the deep sea or the deep sea to deep space are the extremes, but practically every area of technology in between is represented at the Institute as well. So indeed, it makes us very easy to socialize ideas of different technologies about. So I have a couple of examples I'll run through. Again, I believe now that innovation is the sum, and I am an engineer, so there is equations in my presentation, although they take the form of word problems. Innovation is creativity plus invention plus discipline plus awareness. So in the example of Cygnus, it took creativity to think about how can we do this in the simplest way possible. The invention of the satellites is a very difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of discipline, and it takes the awareness to know how can we look all across this field, make sure nobody else is doing this, and make sure this is the best way to solve a problem. But there's been a couple of other recent developments that could only happen if you do something like a spy hop. We had a problem recently where we developed the very best antidote for arsenic poisoning. It has to be delivered intranasally so it can get very quickly to the blood-brain barrier and into the brain. It had to be tested in small mammals. The problem was there was no standard intranasal delivery device for a small mammal nasal cavity. So our chemists that had formulated this drug and had developed it were stuck. They were in the cafeteria. They talked to people from our engine design group, and they said, no problem, we can help you there. We have world-recognized expertise in fuel injectors, creating sprays and patterns and atomizing liquids for delivery in a very precise way. Solve that problem with great innovation through a spy hop. We're doing some novel markerless motion capture. So for professional athletes that typically have to go in and be all suited up to have their movements recorded and analyzed, now all you have to do is walk into a room. And by using machine vision and also using our biodynamics models, we're able to immediately, in real time, construct the musculoskeletal model for the individual or the subject being studied. Chemical threat destruction. We have a process chemistry group that has worked with chemical threats in the past. These could be chemical warfare agents or other toxins. Looking for a portable way to go into a location, a country, or whatever it happens to be, where there are toxins present and destroy those without a lot of ancillary equipment. Well, we use the engine for that. So we inject chemical warfare agents into an engine. This burns and destroys the toxic products, and then you drive it back out. So those are some great, I believe, illustrations of what a spy hop can do. So I wanted to thank you. I wanted to make sure you left with three things today. First of all, consider using a spy hop if you're stuck, or if you're bored, or if you're worried about your strategy. Second, Southwest Research Institute, deep sea to deep space. Third, if you don't buy into the spy hop idea for innovation, also know that on San Juan Island, Washington State, there's a small distillery that produces a gin from apples. It's a great gin, and it's labeled spy hop. So that's the very least you can get out of my presentation today. So thank you for your time.
All right, thank you, Jay. Thank you, Red. Before I get started, I wanted to introduce a set of very, very distinguished visitors, with apologies to Red and to many of the CEOs that are out here and distinguished community leaders. I wanted to guarantee a captive audience this morning, so I invited my parents, John and Gogi Dickson, over here to the right. So Mom and Dad, this is what I do. Always wondered that. So we'll get started. Let me go back to that title for a second and just focus on one word real quickly, and that is existential cybersecurity risk. And if you're not awake, you'll be awake after the next 15 minutes, because I just want to tell a quick little story. For the first time in a very long time, maybe 2 decades, the U.S. Navy started to train its pilots in celestial navigation. And this week in Las Vegas at an exercise called Red Flag, a very large group of Air Force and Navy fighters will be doing simulated air combat in an environment where they're denied GPS. There will be GPS jammers affected that will knock out much of GPS at times in the western states. And you may ask, why does one do that? And it's because it's the growing realization that that either our friends in China or friends in Russia will probably employ that technique in some type of shooting war, probably in our professional lifetimes. So let me start by just talking about the, the surreal nature of this particular presentation. So many of you know me, most of you I'd say in this room know me in this capacity. I will point out that not only in this picture, but in the picture that UT McCombs School had, I'm wearing the same tie that I'm wearing today. So that gives you some sense of how often I wear ties in a suit. It is my favorite tie, for the record, and I think it's a Ferragamo, so like if you're going to have one tie, you ought to go well there. But this is my background. This is my San Antonio background. I'm a serial volunteer. I look at guys like Marty Wenders and Dick Evans and others, and I've tried to mimic them and try to do what they've done. I'm an unabashed cheerleader for San Antonio, outside of San Antonio. So much so that my wife asked me last year, could you not be anybody for this next year? And that was a kind of a humbling moment, to which I responded yes to Ron Nuremberg when he asked me to head up the airport mayor's commission this next year. So that's how I dealt with that one. But here's what I really do. This is the irony, and I do think it's surreal. Most of the time I spend in this other world, which is the security world. And I'm a person that detests the term cyber, certainly as a standalone name. I've been in the business for about 20 years. I just call it security because, candidly, the guns, gates, and guards of physical security is largely understood. This is the realm that really is of challenge. And the way that I put it to certain people is, imagine if you're a civil engineer and I could drop a span in your bridge remotely. I could drop a span in every bridge you've ever built remotely from a country, and you'd never be able to tell who did it. In every bridge, all at the same time, without you ever figuring out. That's the challenge that we have, and that's why this stuff has essentially become much more important and much scarier in a way, is because of the existential challenge that it has for enterprises. So I'll talk about that. A thanks goes out to the McCombs School, the company that we've built here in San Antonio. I do draw upon my experience from the McCombs School every day. I said it when we went to business school, I needed to know everything I could possibly know about everything. I still don't know anything. But it has helped grow this business. We compete internationally, and I'm proud to see Keith Phillips mentioned us. We're trying to grow one person at a time. But we're here in San Antonio, and the way I put it, our real job is to keep our clients out of the news. And the way that I also put it is, what you read about in the news is simply the tip of the iceberg of what's happening right now. We are essentially in a shadow war. And I was trying to figure out the first time the term Cold War was used, because I think in the late 40s and early 50s, people really didn't know what that was. It really wasn't until after the fact that we realized, okay, we were in a standoff, Herculean standoff with the Russians and Chinese. So I would argue that I think we're there right now. We might actually be in the middle of a cyber war, certainly when you start affecting elections. And then, by the way, I hate to break it to 47% of the United States, it was the Russians. It was absolutely the Russians. It was completely the Russians. But the challenge here is that tip of the iceberg is affecting everything that we do. And back in the olden days, like 1997, 2000-ish, when you talk about cybersecurity threats, you talk about people defacing websites, and then it became, people lost their data, and that was kind of, bad. And now it is about the going concern operations of a company. And there are two examples that I cite. Number one is Saudi Aramco and the Sony Entertainment breach that happened about 2.5 years ago. Both of those companies were down for the count. They were not around for a couple of weeks. And so if you go in boardrooms, and I've been in a lot of boardrooms lately, more in the last 2 years than I've been in 20 years, that is the discussion. What do we do when we get in the crosshairs of the North Koreans? What do we do when we get in the crosshairs of the Russians? And because, simply put, that is an uneven fight. And part of that reason is the commercialization, specialization of the threat. If you go back 20 years ago, in order to hack into Citibank, you had to spend a lot of time and research. And you had to, I'm just picking on Citibank, by the way. It could be any bank. And there was an actual hack in 1994. The Herculean amount of effort that you'd have to do to craft that exploit, to build the intelligence, was enormous. So the bad guys would target where all the money is, the top 4 or 5 banks. What's happened now is there's this incredible underground. There's an economy. You hear the term the dark web, another term I don't like. But it's true. There is an economy. There's an eBay of badness that exists out there. And so if you want to cobble together an attack, and if you want to go after a bank or a company, we could start right now. And by Sunday afternoon, I could go rent a call center that uses Google Voice. I could rent a bunch of mules. I could get a bunch of exploit kits. I could put all these things together, and with 3 or 4 smart people, go after a company and probably knock them out. So what that is what's happened in the last 2 or 3. Why you see all this stuff now is you can just go buy this stuff. It's the equivalent of going to Amazon or downloading it, and you can cobble these things together, and you don't need to be incredibly smart. So on top of that, it's this verticalization of the threat, where these guys, now you have there's a malware community. There's a community of writers. That's all they do. There's a ransomware community. The fact that there's a call center that you can rent that completely, when you call them, it sounds like it's the legitimate user, but they're using Google Voice and they're on the other side of the Pacific. That blows my mind, that people are doing that. So what's happening right now? You've got these threats. You've got the nation-state threats. You've got the organized criminals. You've got hacktivists. What I think is going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years, certainly in my professional lifetime, is a handful of things. Number one, the GPS constellation up there that powers everything will be knocked out at some point, either physically or jammed, probably by 2 or 3 of our favorite friends. That is going to happen, everybody. The Air Force knows it. We're trying to put up a series of 3rd-generation GPS satellites that have maneuverability and some defense, but the 1st generation are just dumb satellites up there. The second thing that's going to happen in our professional lifetimes is part of the grid, wherever, will be knocked out. We will be out of power for a substantial time, a la Puerto Rico. But instead of a natural disaster, it will be man-made. And the only reason that hasn't happened up to this point is because once that card is played, again, by our friends, it'll be easy to defend against. So they have that card. They have not played it. And if you listen to the director of NSA, Admiral Rogers, he's been asked here in San Antonio at a chamber event, what's the one thing that keeps you up late at night? It's the electrical grid, because it's powered by a bunch of municipally owned utilities, investor-owned utilities, who don't fully get their nose bloodied every day like the financials. And I'm willing to bet if I went to Jim Googe or to Sean Kennedy or any of the bankers in town, they get it. They understand financial fraud because they're living the dream every day, right? They're getting their teeth kicked in. I mean, it is millions and millions of dollars. But the rest of the world doesn't get it because it's conceptual, it's abstract. So that makes our challenge very difficult. So this malware, what is ransomware? Does everybody understand what ransomware is? How it essentially takes your entire network and makes it unusable. I worked 2 of these issues in the last 2 weeks that never made the press. And so these things make it exceptionally difficult. Any CIO out there that thinks they're immune to this are probably a fool, is what it boils down to. So this is happening across the United States right now. That threat is now going from the city banks down to the smaller organizations. And for those that don't remember, Bear Met Water District down the road, I got to help them 5 years ago when they got nailed by something like this. And the reason they got nailed is because somebody did something dumb, and they realized it was the cash management person that had clicked on a link. And they would have taken every bit of money out if they hadn't been caught. So a couple things: crisis and confidence, both in our networks and the infrastructure that we have on our side. Intel, the entire that vulnerability came out right after Christmas on every chip and every device practically in the planet. This is the meltdown vulnerability in hardware. I mean, that even made my head turn. So what do you want to do? I mean, the reality of it is there's two groups of folks out there. You're either targeted or you're a target of opportunity. If you're a bank or financial institution, you're under incredible assault all the time. There are some very sophisticated players that live out at 9800 Fredericksburg, if you know where that is, that every day fight that war. And by the way, half of them are ex-Air Force for the record. They went from Security Hill right over to the other side of town. And so the key is, if you're not one of these guys, is how do you stay off that radar screen? How do you keep your hygiene up? And that's the challenge. So what can you do to innovate and survive? And that is to understand from your organization what your risk appetite is. What's the right amount of security? You don't want to overspend too. I mean, if you're Lind, you don't want to spend $45 million. You're not NSA, right? But you still have like if you can't operate, that affects somebody, right? So the other thing is, I see most of us are becoming very cybersecurity aware and savvy and asking better questions and understanding, like, you're not trying to do something separate from the business. This is part of the business now. So what I see out in the marketplace are a lot of technical solutions. Cyber insurance is a great example of innovation responding. So like if you get nailed, you can get, if you fall and can't get up, now somebody help you get up. Blockchains, if you've heard what that is, behind the scenes, and trust models. And artificial intelligence has a lot of promise, and this is essentially adaptive learning and ways to understand trends. Because if you talk to a security guy, they say, I'm trying to find a needle in a stack of needles. Like, I'm looking at network flow with millions and millions of messages and packets, and how do I find that one bad guy? And that's really, really difficult. And the other thing is they're just moving faster. Everyone, if you've ever heard this term DevOps, what that means is essentially people are building products and doing software releases every day. And they're building it and automating it in a way so that, like, the time from concept and whiteboard to production is now measured in weeks and days. So this idea of building software that took years or whatever is simply a cliche. So my message to you is that the innovation part of it is having to innovate, really for survival in a Darwinian kind of way, because what we see, because we have the front row in the sausage making process, is that sausage making process is exceptionally fragile. And I do think some of those kind of dystopian ideas that I had are gonna happen. And they're just gonna happen in our lifetimes. And how we react and how we rebound is going to drive where we go. Just a quick aside, who's heard of Jungle Disk out there? Local-based company. Okay, Rackspace founders spun out, great guys. You know what they do? They do backups of people's servers. You think that's the unsexiest part of IT is backups, right? Guess what's super sexy now? Backups, because of ransomware. Because when you have a hiccup and you get your stuff, encrypted, oh, wait a second, I just have a backup that I have over here. I'll just restore it. So suddenly that's here in San Antonio. That's right up the street. The other thing, just to pass on to everybody, and Sean and Richard know this really, really well wherever you are, there are 4,500 people at NSA Texas that do this mission every day, about 5,000 at the 25th Air Force and another 4,000 at the 24th Air Force. What they're doing is they're trying to make sure that they're faster than the other person, because you don't have to be the fastest person on the block, you just need to be faster than the guy next to you when the bear is chasing you. And that is absolutely the ethos of every security person. You don't need to be perfect, you just need to be better than that other guy. And so you want to be that guy in the front, not the hippie behind him with the tripod. So with that, I'll leave it for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. So if you have questions, if you want to send them our way, we'll walk around and gather them. Maybe I'll start with one for the panel, just as a professor and as a producer of talent from the school. Could you all talk a little bit about what you see as talent needs? So we talked about innovation, and Adam, you talked about characteristics of innovation, and Keith, your take on the macroeconomy and where you see sort of labor needs. So if you don't mind talking about, if you had a student going to college now or going to grad school, what kind of things might you think about focusing on, and where's going to be the biggest needs going forward? Anybody want it first?
Well, do we have an hour or two? Or I'll take a shot at it as an employer. I mean, analytical skills, be able to communicate, you mentioned it, collaborate, working together. That is anathema to many of the millennial values that we see. But it's talent. The interesting thing, we did a census of our company, and 90% of the people in our company did not go to high school here. And 2/3 didn't go to college in the state of Texas. So that's the bad news. The good news is we've been a magnet for recruiting them to Texas. But I would say continue to do what you're doing, because you're right, the shortage in talent is right now, right here.
Other thoughts?
I would say data skills. There's incredible amounts of data that are being generated by sensors of all different types, measurements of all different types. There's so much data now that we just don't have the capacity to really mine or understand. So I think that would be very important. But I would also second the multidisciplinary expertise that's required now as we go moving into the Internet of Things. There's this cyber, sorry, I know you don't like that term.
So you just throw security on it.
Cyber mechanical link, where you have people that are very good in cyber and very good at design, but it's connecting or bridging those that is difficult.
And I think Elon Musk cites the fact that he reads voraciously, I think a book a week or something, and has this very cross-disciplinary view. And I think metaphors from the medical world about viruses and inoculation are directly valid in our worlds, as an example.
So go ahead.
Well,
Keith, go ahead.
as you know, it's a big question. My mic on? No, it's not, because I have it off up here. As Blake mentioned, our bank president is really interested in the technology-enabled disruption, and we're seeing it right now, obviously, in retail, but we'll see it in transportation coming up. And so here's a lot of people that are likely to lose their jobs, and where are they going to go is what I get asked. And I think healthcare is obviously one place they're going to need to go. No one in this room is getting any younger. And as the population ages, there's increased demand for healthcare services. But also cybersecurity. I mean, it's one of the great things about, people ask me, well, why don't we grow as fast as Austin? And we're not Austin, and we shouldn't try to be Austin. But we do have a big military background. We need to leverage that. And I think a lot of the growth in cybersecurity comes from our military foundation here. And I can't think of an industry that's more likely to grow in the future than cybersecurity. Every business group we meet with talk about, I'm not supposed to use cyber, talk about security over the internet. So I think, obviously a lot of this involves retraining and skills. Some of the jobs in healthcare will be assistants and aides and stuff that won't require as much education. There's a lot of good community colleges doing these specialties in healthcare, like doing these tests on individuals where you get a certificate. But a lot of it's going to be required at the very high level. I know we don't produce enough engineers in Texas. We don't produce enough engineers in the U.S., and that's a big challenge.
All right, thanks. And so you mentioned growth. Feeding on that, Keith, just to be clear, and I can't remember if it's in your slides or not, but questions about what's your prediction for Texas growth in 2018? And
So,
go ahead.
Well, we focus on job growth because we don't really, even though there is some annual data on GDP, we don't really have good GDP data at the state level. So we look at job growth, and because it's fairly accurate and it's matters to people. So last year was 2.4, and we expect about 2.8 this year. It would be higher if it wasn't for the very tight labor markets.
Thanks. And questions about China. So the statistic quoted is China says its GDP growth is 6.8%. Is that a real number? Do you believe it? You didn't touch too much on, didn't have time to talk about international, but any comments on China and what you see there?
Well, there's a lot of numbers in China you might not believe, obviously, but I think the reason why GDP has been strong, it's probably close to accurate. They came from a very, very low base. They were like behind the rest of the world for like 1,000 years. And so they're playing catch up, but the problem is in order to keep growth that high, you have to continue to liberalize your economy. You have to, this all started with allowing some private property. And, but that's not consistent with a communist government. To free up your banking industry, to make, basically they have government-run banks. So it's not likely to happen. So it seems like a high level relative to the U.S., obviously, but they've been so far behind. Incomes were very low relative to the U.S., and they're playing catch up. But this growth is likely to, economists have been predicting it would slow for a while now, just because they can't keep turning more power over to the market and less from government.
John, go ahead.
I worry that that same mentality about making up for 1,000 years is being played out in the international kind of strategy sense as well, or stage. I was in Singapore last year. I flew over and looked down, and I saw the Spratly Islands, and I took a picture and said, you don't know what these are now, but you will in the short-term future. The problem we have right now is this resurgence of, this resurgence of national identity. And I'll give you a great example. At Davos 2 or 3 years ago, there was a guy that stood up and said, look, we never got to end World War II on our terms. Like, we bore the brunt of most of the Japanese, atrocities, rape in Nanjing, the occupation. But it was the Americans that came in and ended it and we didn't. And so there's this really kind of pent up weird nationalistic pride that is starting to play out in a variety of ways. Cybersecurity, cyber attacks are one of them, but that is the thing that is most worrisome. Those are the other side of that coin. And if you go out to Security Hill, you go out to behind the Academy at 151 and 410, those guys every day, that's who they're dealing with. They're not dealing with the Argentinian hackers, not dealing with the Ecuadorian hacker. It's all day long.
So maybe we can end on a more positive note, so I'll take a step back. So get the scary question out of the way first. So one of the questions is just really for each of you, what if you had one thing to worry about, what's the worry? And I don't know, Keith, you want to just go down the road? Keith, you want to start about from the economic standpoint, what would keep you up?
Yeah, I would say immigration and trade, I guess.
From a policy standpoint?
Yeah, from a policy standpoint, we need labor, as many of the developed world will in the next 20, 30 years. And right now we're moving in the opposite direction of that. There have been some good reforms. I think we need to rethink how we do immigration, but I think the answer is not less. I think it's more.
Adam?
Federal budget, not having one is problematic.
That's right.
Continuing resolutions make it difficult to be innovative, to think about what needs to be done next, because you're just getting funded to do the same old thing. So getting that cleared up and really adopting a perspective that we need to have a real budget every year is important. And I haven't seen any administration recently that's been willing to do that.
I have no worries.
No?
I would say that I was flying back from Phoenix yesterday, and then I think it's this week's Economist is front page story about the potential war. I would say, as a student, as a person that grew up in the Cold War, as a military officer, born in Berlin, grew up all over the place, it seemed remote and unconscionable, like as if. And I worry that it has become much more of a valid option for people on both sides in a way that is deeply disturbing. And that's the black swan event that the Keith Phillips of the world don't have to think about, but that would disrupt everything in a way that hasn't since 1941, I think. So.
Yeah, that would throw my forecast off, so I worry about it.
So, John, a follow-up on something you mentioned. Questions, you mentioned that if somebody knocks out the grid, they can do it once. But,
No,
but
and what I meant by that is, again, and I won't point at anybody in the audience, but we've had a lot of engagement with that. The boards of directors and the leadership of most energy companies view cybersecurity as an abstract threat. It happens to other people because it's not happening to them. The reason that you don't play that card if you're again, in this order, Chinese, Russians, Iranians, and North Koreans, is we will have, our response will be to throw a TSA-like level of resources at that protection. It'll never happen again. Around industrial control systems, around it. So the thought is you hold that card until you need it, which is when you need it. And that's what everyone's afraid of, because when we go in and do, find things, we find stuff that's like there's evidence of exploitations. So that's if you talk to, again, the guys out at 410 or the guys over there, that's their worry as well.
We're working that issue as well, but from a different perspective. We did a spy hop and saw that that is a threat. So we have some projects now in building power plants that are 20% the size of existing power plants that create the same amount of energy, so we can distribute the power generation networks or nodes across the country. Also working on energy storage and looking at ways of integrating renewables into our grid to make it more robust, so we'll be able to recover more quickly from an attack.
And you made a great point. I mean, the entire grid is designed for resilience against natural events, not man-made events. And so that's the real key problem. And we've inherited almost 100 years worth of infrastructure. It is difficult to fix that overnight.
So given Red's background, let's finish with cars. So one of the some questions here about autonomous vehicles. I was talking to Joe earlier about this, and what's the outlook on autonomous vehicles, either from a security standpoint, or what's the spy hop going to be that's going to change the way we get around? And Keith, if you want to comment anything on the macro side or other economic side of this, what are we looking at in our next 10, 15, 20 years, or our careers or lifetimes?
I won't even talk about the security thing. I think that it changes civil engineering as we know it, because if I can optimize, I don't need to build 6 lanes wide in Houston. I can build 3 or 4 lanes and optimize that traffic. So I think it'll have disruptive effects in ways that we don't know. I think it'll be ubiquitous in 5 to 10 years. And I think, like a great example on this airport thing, I have not rented a car for ages because Uber is way too easy, right? And I think that'll be even easier. I'll just hop in and I'll be on conference calls and some robot will take me to where I go and I don't care. I mean, there's no joy in the point-to-point travel, so I think that'll happen very, very quickly.
I think the age of innovation is just about mature for autonomous vehicles. It's not really a technical challenge to actually have an autonomous vehicle. Where the innovation is needed is in making decisions as you collect data in a vehicle that's autonomous. Something, not a somebody, is going to have to make decisions that will have life and death impacts on us. And so that's really where we see the biggest impediment to implementation of autonomous vehicles now. We have arguably the best autonomous navigation system for off-road vehicles in the world that was developed here in San Antonio. There are many players that have on-road autonomous navigation systems, but nobody has really solved this problem of, I have a dilemma that is presented to my car. How does it solve that dilemma? Is it going to endanger myself and my passengers, or this potential threat?
I think the impact on the auto insurance business is going to be profound. 95% auto accidents are, driver related. I think most of the insurance companies know that, and they are trying to adapt and adjust. But those are the kind of secondary things that I think are fascinating, is what happens when that's no longer a problem.
All right. Brad, any final words?
I'm scared.
All right. We'll innovate our way out of it. So thank you all very much for coming. How about one more round for our panelists?